hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at fair liberty's call. No tyrannous act shall suppress your just claim, or stain with dishonor America's name. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, our money we'll give. Our worthy forefathers, let's give them a cheer. To climates unknown did courageously steer. Through oceans to deserts for freedom they came, and dying bequeathed us their freedom and fame. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, our money we'll give.
It is hour 3 of Bill Mick Live on this Tuesday morning, the 9th of June, 2026. Dave Bowman along with us in an hour, brought to you by O'Galley Electric. And Tuesday at 8 o'clock, it is Dave Does History. Dave and I were having a fun conversation as this hour started. Sorry for the slight delay in getting to you, but we are here. Dave, where are we going today as we get ready to march? We are less than a month away in Liberty 250 from July 4th of 1776. Where are we living today?
I keep going back to that phone call that we got, 4 or 5 years ago now. You know, Dave, only 4 or 5 people did anything anyway, so what does it matter? And I keep coming back. I don't even remember who made that phone call, but this concept that we don't know who these people were, this is part of this educational process that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. We spoke briefly last week about the Articles of Confederation, the vote on July 2nd, and we mentioned a man by the name of John Dickinson, who absented himself from that vote. I want you to understand how important that is to your history. The reason you're sitting here today in the country we're in is because John Dickinson decided to skip that vote that day. Oh, and by the way, he also would go on to do some other things, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. He entered the Revolutionary era carrying a reputation that almost no other man could match. In 1776, John Dickinson was probably the second most famous man in America, behind only George Washington. Long before Thomas Jefferson would write the Declaration of Independence, Dickinson had been its best-known political writer in the entire British North America. He was the voice many colonists turned to when they sought a constitutional defense of their rights. He wrote America's first protest song. Not kidding. And
I like it.
For a time, he stood at the very center of the entire American resistance movement.
And we pick it up in just 1 minute here on this Tuesday edition of Bill Mick Live. Dave, before we get too far away from it, this little protest song that Dickinson wrote, is it anything that, is it a ditty we remember? Is it Yankee Doodle or something?
No, in fact, when he wrote the song, he set it to a old English hymn that I find particularly clunky and annoying.
Okay.
And so I'm not trying to brag or anything here, but if you go to my website later on today, davedoeshistory.org, you click on today's episode, scroll down there, you will hear the song as it's his words. He wrote it. I just updated it a bit, and I think you'll find it a very interesting song. It's a fascinating song in the sense that it is a protest song, but it is a song that it's not a song that says, hey, we don't want to pay our taxes. It says we want to pay our taxes, but ...
Okay,
we want to do it as British, not as slaves.
Links to both Dave Does History and What the Frock on the show page today at BillMick.com. That title, AI and American Pride. We're heavy into the American Pride part right now, by the way. Go ahead, Dave.
Dickinson's born in 1732. He studies law in London. He returns to the United States, and by the mid-1760s, John Dickinson is the most respected political thinker in all of America. You might have thought it was John Adams. You might have thought it was somebody else. No, it's John Dickinson. His first real great moment comes during the Stamp Act crisis in 1765. When the whole thing goes on, it's Dickinson who drafts what becomes the Congress's Declaration of Rights and Resolves. It's a document that carefully asserts that the colonial assemblies alone possess the authority to tax their own citizens, which is pretty much what he says in his song that he publishes in 1768. It rejects the parliamentary taxation system, but it maintains that loyalty to the king and the British constitutional system. And this is a theme for Dickinson. It helps establish the framework that will guide the resistance for the next decade. Colonists at that point were not claiming independence, they were claiming their rights as Englishmen. The essays that he wrote, the song that he wrote, they spread like wildfire despite that really crappy tune, the old oak bucket or something like that. They were reprinted everywhere from New Hampshire to Georgia. Colonists read them, much as they would do with Common Sense later on. They discussed them in taverns, meeting houses, town squares, and churches. The arguments that he made were sophisticated, but he was also able to simplify them and make them understandable, much like Rush Limbaugh, making the incomprehensible comprehensible.
Sure.
Dickinson was not against Parliament. He recognized Parliament's authority to regulate trade, but he rejected Parliament's attempt to use taxation as a means of raising revenue from people who had no representation in that body. He wasn't saying that Parliament couldn't tax them. He was saying that the taxes, number one, had to be for a specific purpose, not just general revenue. And number two, we had to have representation. Two arguments that still resonate today, I would think. Mm-hmm. That distinction matters enormously. Dickinson warned that accepting even a small unconstitutional tax, it's just a penny, would establish a dangerous precedent. Once Parliament possessed the ability, the power to tax the colonials at will, there would be no practical limit to that authority.
How many times has he been proven right, even in our local governments here today?
In the last week?
Yeah.
His essays that he wrote would transform him into what many of his contemporaries would call the Penman of the Revolution. Long before Thomas Jefferson ever became known, Dickinson was the writer whose words unified the colonial resistance. John Adams would later admit that the book that he wrote, Farmer's Letters, had a tremendous impact on public opinion. Franklin praised them, Washington read them carefully, and across the colonies, Dickinson became one of the most trusted advocates for American rights. But, the very principles that made him a revolutionary hero would eventually place him at odds with the growing independence movement. Can you already see why? Hopefully you can. By early 1776, Dickinson occupied a position of extraordinary influence. He was in the Continental Congress. He remained a dominant figure in Pennsylvania politics. His prestige was such that very few people could just ignore his opinion. If Sam Adams represented the radical wing of resistance, Dickinson stood as the leading spokesman for those who still hoped the empire could be made and preserved through reconciliation. The situation, of course, was becoming extremely difficult. The fighting would influence things. It had already broken out, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Boston. Those things were going on. But Dickinson continued to believe that the colonies should not rush into declaring independence before every possibility of settlement had been exhausted. His reasoning was practical as much as philosophical. We lacked formal alliances with any foreign power. The military situation was uncertain. The governments were still evolving. We look at things today and we take things for granted. 1776, the picture was not that clear. It was not clear that we were going to win. It was not clear that France was going to join us. The independence, he believed, once declared, could not be withdrawn, and he feared that premature break could produce a disaster. Using his considerable influence, he helped secure instructions from the Pennsylvania Assembly that prohibited Pennsylvania's delegates from voting for independence. Now, to our ears today, that might sound like obstruction, but Dickinson saw it as responsible statesmanship. He believed that Congress should move cautiously, maintain colonial unity, and seek one final constitutional settlement before crossing the point of no return.
So did he think that was coming, but we deserve to give peace a chance here?
It's not clear to me that he believed that that was coming, but certainly things were changing with common sense, the way the nation was going. The radicals were gaining strength in 76. He found himself swimming against the rising political tide. Common sense had electrified the public in ways that his own writings had once done, but now even more so. And colonial assemblies were voting to authorize independence. North Carolina, Virginia, Delaware. But Dickinson was firm. He was not defending British policy. He was defending a strategy. He believed that declaring independence before the colonies were fully prepared would place everything at risk. And soon that would lead him into direct conflict with Adams, Lee, Thomas Jefferson. All of these people would be on opposite sides. Ironically, that would also become his greatest achievement, because while history remembers him as the man who opposed the Declaration of Independence, we often forget what happened afterwards. The man who said, "not yet," to independence would ultimately help answer a far more difficult question. Once independence was achieved, how exactly should Americans govern themselves? And that may be where you've heard the name before, because John Dickinson, even though he lost on July 2nd, 1776, didn't quit. He was still an American hero and still one of the giants of the American Revolution.
And we pick it up there as we continue on Bill Mick Live. Dave back with us in moments. Hey, on the Florida Roundtable this weekend, we're going to talk space with Jim Banky, updates and the future. That's going to be fun this weekend on the Florida Roundtable. We continue in moments.
History didn't happen quietly, and neither do we. Dave Does History rolls on, right here on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric are our sponsor. By the way, you can follow us on Instagram at WMMB Radio. So, Dave, we're taking a look at John Dickinson, one of those names that we may not have known, but one we should really think about, huh?
In more ways than we've even gotten to so far. By July of 1776, Dickinson is embattled. For a decade before this, he has been the leading voice for defending American rights, but now he's finding himself urging caution while the radicals in Congress are demanding independence. It might seem contradictory to us today. You might be saying, Dave, why are we talking about this guy if he was against it? He's not against it. What he's against is rushing into things. He understood things that perhaps the rest of the people in Congress did not. He had been on the Committee of Secret Correspondence that Congress had established. That was their diplomatic service. He had access to information that wasn't available to most of the delegates. While many Americans were hoping that a Declaration of Independence would immediately bring foreign allies rushing in, France and Spain, Dickinson knew better. He knew that France hated Britain and that Spain distrusts Britain, but that doesn't guarantee military support for a rebellion that, again, in 1776, it's not certain who's going to win. I know we look at history now as inevitable. There was really no way the British could have maintained this stuff, and I've said that here. But that's hindsight. In 1776, no one knew that.
It was all speculative then, and dangerous speculation at that.
As he was watching the events accelerate, Thomas Paine's common sense, of course, spread through the colonies. Colonial assemblies began authorizing legislation to declare independence. It wasn't that Dickinson was against American liberty, as Bill heard in the song during the break. He wants American liberty, but he's opposing what he views as dangerous haste. His concern is straightforward. The colonies are about to destroy one government before they construct another. They're preparing to sever ties with the most powerful empire on earth without establishing a functioning national government to replace it. And to Dickinson's viewpoint, that's not prudence, it's gambling.
All right, Dave, let's see where we're going now.
We talked last week about the vote on July 2nd. What we didn't really talk about was the July 1st issues. Congress had put a 3-week delay on June 10th because they wanted more instructions from the colonial governments and so forth and so on. By the time July 1st rolls around, they're supposed to have the debate that day. But it's Dickinson who takes the floor, and he gives perhaps his most passionate speech of his entire career. He warns Congress that declaring independence without prior guarantees of foreign alliances will leave the colonies defenseless against the full might of the British military. Maybe you agree with that, maybe you don't. I mean, Washington had proven pretty effective so far, and keep in mind that the day before, a couple of days before this, we had beaten the British Navy at Sullivan's Island. We haven't talked about that yet, but we will. And you know, it wasn't looking like we were that militarily weak. So maybe that warning gets kind of downplayed. He warns about domestic instability. Tearing down the British system without first ratifying a national constitution risks plunging the colonies into anarchy and interstate conflict, a very real concern.
Mm-hmm.
People are kind of like, well, okay, yeah, maybe so, but isn't that what you're working on? Question mark. And he also recognizes the fact that his stance is costing him. He actually says, my conduct this day, July 1st, I expect will give the finishing blow to my once too great and now too diminished popularity, unquote. He understands that by standing against independence on July 1st, he is risking his entire, well, he's basically smashed everything that he's worked for all of these years that he has been defending American rights and American liberties. He's so concerned, though. He keeps talking about, we're trying to brave this storm in a skiff made out of paper. A skiff is a small boat. He talks about, see if these words don't sound vaguely familiar to you, destroying a house before we've gotten another one in wintertime with a small family. We don't want to be doing this stuff. It's dangerous. He was asking, what are you declaring independence for? If you do that, who's going to govern? How will the states cooperate? How will laws be enforced? How would the war even be funded? How would a union actually function? These are the questions that are on his mind.
He's not wrong in any of those.
Not only is he not wrong, but back on June 11th, 3 weeks before this, Congress had formed those committees, those 3 committees, and one of those committees was to come up with a constitution for the United States of America. And the head of that committee was John Dickinson. And he's the one actually writing what will ultimately become the Articles of Confederation, as he's sitting here arguing against independence because of all the people in this room, Bill. He's the one that knows that the Constitution is not ready. We don't have a functioning government yet. And even John Adams had said, we need to build a functioning system in order to declare independence. And until we do, and until we get that done, you can't really go forward from this. You're going to cause problems. And, of course, this leads to the events of July 2nd. We talked about Caesar Rodney writing from Delaware. We talked about the final vote for independence and how this is going to happen. And it all happens because Dickinson recognizes the fact that even though he opposes this, even though he is American through and through, he's one of the first people to actually use the term Americans to define us, to describe us. Even with all of that, he recognizes the fact that if he votes his conscience, he can't support independence, which means Pennsylvania doesn't vote for it, which means it is not unanimous, which means you can't write the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States. And so he and Robert Morris of the Pennsylvania delegation on the morning of July 2nd, they call out sick. They just decide we're not going to go. Because if we go, we have to vote our conscience, and we can't do that. Things have to move forward. And we're just in the way now.
Interesting he recognized that and took that action.
It's fascinating, and it's addition by subtraction, I guess, in a way. And it's a moment that, again, if he doesn't do that, maybe we declare independence, maybe we don't. But, oh, by the way, he's still working on those articles, that Constitution. He's still thinking about how we're going to govern this stuff. He's still thinking about his reputation. And he decides after this vote that since I'm not really hopeful here, I guess I should go do something else in the middle of a war.
And we'll see where it takes us as Dave Does History continues on Bill Mick Live in moments here on WMMB.
No spin, no sugar, just the story as it was. This is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric bringing you the hour. You want to weigh in? Questions or comments for Dave? 321-768-1240. Now's the time. We'll get you lined up and let you in with Dave momentarily. But Dave first going to wrap up for us this tale of John Dickinson and the conflict that he was in, yet integral in writing our first Constitution and this declaration that's coming. Dave, go right ahead, sir.
If his story ended on July 2nd, 1776, when he didn't vote, you might just remember him as the man who just opposed independence. But that's not where his story ends. In many ways, it's where it really begins. He opposed independence, but that doesn't mean that he didn't support it. In fact, he did something that most of his critics did not do. He was one of only two members, along with Thomas McKean of Delaware, to actually take up arms and see military service during the Revolution. That comes at a great political cost, a personal cost. His former allies viewed him with suspicion, yet when the fighting intensified, he joined what was known then as the Philadelphia Associators, which would be a great baseball team name. One of the Pennsylvania's largest military formations. He was commissioned as a brigadier general in the Associators. And during the campaigns of 76 and 77, he commanded troops in New Jersey while Washington was struggling to keep the Revolutionary Army alive. He was there. For him, for Dickinson, this was not a controversial situation. It was not a contradiction with his earlier beliefs. It was actually the fulfillment of them. He had opposed the timing of independence, not the defense of American liberties. And once independence became the chosen course, his duty demanded that he help secure it. His military career was brief, but important. There were political disputes, of course, in a militia, because there always are, so he resigned his commission. But in September of 1777, at the Battle of Brandywine, one of the most important battles in the earlier Revolution, he was an ordinary private. He had enlisted as a private in the Delaware militia. Now think about that for just a moment. This guy is one of the wealthiest men in America, one of the most famous men in America. He's a former delegate to the Continental Congress, and now he is in the ranks of the Army as a common soldier.
After having been a general, by the way.
After having been a general. That tells us more than any political speech ever could. Mm-hmm. The war also taught him lessons that profoundly altered his understanding of government. Throughout the conflict, by November of 1777, the Articles of Confederation, which he had helped draft, were weak. Congress couldn't raise any money. They struggled to coordinate things. The states were... The weakness of the Articles of Confederation was everything had to be unanimous. And like all confederations, it was falling down in the same area, which is that the central government couldn't command things. And Dickinson, who had pretty much drafted them himself, was one of the first people to recognize that. He had once feared concentrated authority, But now he was watching the dangers of not having at least a little bit of concentrated authority. He didn't become an advocate of unlimited federal power, but it did convince him that a successful republic would require a stronger national framework than most Americans had initially imagined. After the war, 1781, he became the president of Delaware, serving as his country's state's chief executive. And a year later, he was elected to the president of Pennsylvania. You don't have to live in the same states. Effectively, he was the governor of one of the most important states in the Union, Pennsylvania. These are not ceremonial positions. These are important, navigating through crises as the war was coming to the end. In the summer of 1783, hundreds of unpaid Continental soldiers gathered in Philadelphia to demand compensation from Congress, and it escalated into what became known as the Pennsylvania Mutiny. Members of Congress found themselves effectively trapped while the former veterans surrounded the State House. Pennsylvania authorities proved unable or unwilling to disperse the soldiers. Congress fled, went to New Jersey. The incident shocked leaders. If Congress couldn't even protect itself, how could it protect a nation? And for Dickinson, this mutiny was a lesson that the Revolution had repeatedly taught him. Liberty requires effective institutions. Independence alone is not enough. Government has to function. And by the mid-1780s, it had become obvious to pretty much everybody that the Articles of Confederation were just not working, because confederations never do. You had trade disputes between states. You had financial problems. You had Rhode Island. You had all this stuff. And so in 1786, there was a convention held in Annapolis, Maryland, called the Annapolis Convention. It's the Annapolis Convention that decides to call the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. And it's Dickinson, John Dickinson, who chairs the Annapolis Convention. And then attends the Constitutional Convention in 1787, once again representing Pennsylvania. He was right in the center of things again. He was representing Delaware. He became one of the most respected leaders there, and he was one of the leaders in establishing two things that are most important to us. He was very much in favor of the small states having representation. That was one of the biggest challenges. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states were afraid of being swallowed up. It's Dickinson who plays a critical role in solving that solution and crafting what will become the Great Compromise. The reason we have a House based on population and a Senate based on state. He helped create that. It's known today as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, but without that compromise, there's no Constitution. He's also the man who essentially, and we actually did a Dave Does History several years ago about this, he's actually the man who invents the presidency. He's the guy that comes up with the idea that this is what the president should do, the president should be. The man who once worried that America was moving too quickly to independence becomes one of the principal architects of the government, the Constitution, that made independence actually sustainable, make it actually work. And, of course, his final years reveal another dimension of his character. Like many Americans of his generation, he benefited from slavery. Yet over the times, he came to view slavery as fundamentally inconsistent with the principles for which the Revolution had been fought. This is one of the most important lessons. People throw this at us all the time. The founders owned slaves. They were human beings. They weren't perfect. But they began to look at things and they began to wrestle with the idea that if we really believe this, then we can't live that life and we have to change ourselves. And long before many of his contemporaries reached similar conclusions, John Dickinson took action. He freed his slaves and became became an advocate for abolition. These traits appear throughout his life. Whether others agreed with him or not, he consistently attempted to align his actions with his conscience. When he died in 1808, the political battles of 1776 had been largely forgotten. The nation he helped create was entering a new era, and Thomas Jefferson, whose declaration Dickinson had opposed, recognized the magnitude of his contributions and later described him as, quote, one of the great worthies of the Revolution, unquote, and would always remember him as one of the earliest and most effective defenders of American rights.
And we continue in 1 minute, 321-768-1240 if you want in with Dave Bowman. You know, Dave, it's interesting to me that this started out for Dickinson as respectful yet principled resistance to how this was moving, and yet he comes off at the end as one of the great worthies of the Revolution. He went through, I wouldn't say change. I think he stayed true to his principles throughout this, but he transformed into how he could best serve the country and his principles, and did it in great fashion.
You know, it always starts that way, doesn't it? We start with this promise, this idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. How many of us live up to that, even today? And as a nation, we have grown from saying that to putting that in action, sometimes fitfully, sometimes resistively. John Dickinson's story is our story. And he does everything that we have done. He's a veteran. He's a legislator. He's a, for all practical purposes, a preacher. He was a Quaker, or he wasn't formally a Quaker, but he held Quaker beliefs. He serves as an executive. He serves as in Congress, in committees, and all these things. And he's never the loudest voice in the Revolution. He was never the most celebrated. He didn't seek popularity. He sacrificed it. Yet he is the man whose fingerprints are everywhere, all over this thing. There's like I said, they call it this popular myth that just a handful of people actually did something. But John Dickinson reminds us how incomplete that story really is. Without Jefferson, there may not have been a declaration. Without Washington, there may have not have been a victory. And without John Dickinson, private on the field at Brandywine, maybe we did get defeated at Brandywine, but maybe the army gets destroyed. Without John Dickinson, though, there may have been no government capable of preserving either victory or independence. And that's why it's important that we remember him.
You know, speaking about his ideals here, and they're ingrained in what we do. I saw a headline this morning doing show prep. I didn't bring the story into today's show about this pastor in New England at a Biden favorite location who has canceled her church's celebration of this 250th anniversary because the promise of these founding documents, and she trashed the founding documents because we're not there yet. It tells me she doesn't understand what ideals are. They are things to live up to, and they're not goals you always attain. And because America hadn't got there in 250 years, we are certainly a lot farther along that line than we were when they were written. And living to achieve them is the challenge, whether we fully get there or not. And we're a lot closer than this lady wants to give us credit for.
I wonder what Dickinson would say to her. You know, what are you doing personally to live up to your conscience? Because this is what I did. And if we're not willing to do that, then you're right. We're not going to meet that promise. But that is the promise of the greatest sentence ever written, is the fact that we keep moving forward and we create a more perfect union. And thanks to people like John Dickinson, we can continue to do that.
Ideals mean just that, something to live up to. And if we could all keep it in mind, we'd be better off. Dave Bowman, another great edition of Dave Does History. Any idea where we go next week?
Next week, we're going to talk about the first American composer, a man by the name of Francis Hopkinson.
And we do that next Tuesday on Bill Mick Live. O'Galley Electric brought you this hour of today's show. Thanks for being here. Glenn Beck's next. Dave, we'll talk next week.
See you then.
The tree their own hands had to liberty reared, they lived to behold, growing strong and revered. With transport they cried, now our wishes we gain, for our children shall gather the fruits of our pain. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as freemen, our money we'll give. Then join hand in hand, brave Americans all. By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall. In so righteous a cause, let us hope to succeed, for heaven approves of each generous deed. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as freemen, our money we'll give. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as freemen, our money we'll give.